Well, divisive, exhausting, unnecessary, or important and informative. The words you use to describe the so called culture war debates in Canada depend a lot on who you are. The Angus Reid Institute has done extensive polling around how Canadians communicate with one another. We all agree that it's changing, but spoiler alert, Canadians are split on whether the changes are good or bad. For the first half of the program today, we're joined by the research director of the Angus Reid Institute. In the second half hour, we're going to reconvene our political panel, made up of folks from across the province and across the political spectrum. But of course, we want to hear from you. Is cancel culture about suppression or accountability? Do you think it's a good thing that people are now more careful about the words they use so they don't offend? Dave Korzinski is a research director at the Angus Reid Institute, and he joins us now. Dave, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Happy to talk about these issues. These are some fun and meaty ones to get into.
Yeah, well, before we get too deeply into it, what are we talking about when you designed the poll? What did you have in mind when
Mhm.
you used the term culture wars?
Yeah, it's interesting because the culture wars kind of starts as this American phenomenon that I think a lot of people were watching in the early 2000s and thinking, what the heck is going on down there with the war on Christmas and some of the conversations that people were having and holding brands accountable for positions that they didn't agree with. And this has really escalated to the point where you've got, Tucker Carlson was calling out M&Ms for the gender of their spokespeople or spokes candies, I guess, if you will. So we wanted to ask Canadians, are we changing the way that we talk? Are we changing language? And around that, what are your views of all of these different issues? This is actually I think this is going to end up being 5 or 6 parts, this entire series. We're going to talk about the initial kind of batch of data, which really looks at what the culture wars are. So we're talking Indigenous issues, we're talking free speech and language, gender, transgender issues. We talked about the policy that New Brunswick initiated, that Saskatchewan has since followed. That's in there. So anything that's kind of like a social issue that is dividing the country, we want to look at this and see, do we have common ground? Things like climate change, even economic policy, that's very wide ranging, which is why we've distilled it into these 5 mindsets to help people kind of understand where we're coming from. But when we're all said and done, this is going to be a really big project that's looking at a number of different issues. Basically, anything you might argue with your friends or your family over is probably in here.
Well, over the course of the conversation, we'll dig more deeply into some of those opinions and thoughts. But what did you find out about how Canadians talk to one another? Is it actually changing, and are we losing the ability to have a civilized conversation about these issues?
Yeah, what's interesting is that the number of people who, on a question like how often do you self-censor, how often do you hold your tongue, the number is actually pretty consistent no matter where you are on the spectrum. There's about 13 to 15% of people who say, I do this all the time. And then you've got large groups of people who just say, no, that's not something I really engage with. So it doesn't seem to matter where you are in terms of your perspective on that self-censoring question. But when we talk about society more broadly, are we changing the way that we talk to each other? Are we becoming more careful with language? That's what a lot of the movements have been in the last 10, 15, 20 years, is that we've got to take into account the views of other people. If you ask the advocate side of this, the more left-leaning progressive side, people who have been disenfranchised, people who don't have the same expression as everybody else. We've got to change our language to incorporate those groups and to be sensitive to those groups. What you've got is Canadians generally agree that we're doing that. They're pretty divided over whether or not that's a good thing. So 47% say we're changing the way we talk, we're being more careful, that's a good thing. 35% say, yeah, we're doing that, but that's a bad thing. We're becoming too censored. We're worried too much about offending people. So you can see there, that's 80% of the population who are kind of, fighting over this main issue. And then you've got other people who don't think that we're changing the way that we talk. That's not something they're perceiving. But broadly speaking, 4 and 5 say, yeah, we're changing the way we talk. and they kind of disagree about whether or not that's something they want to continue to pursue, or we've got to knock it off. We've got to get back to just talking to each other and not being so worried about saying something that might be offensive, and as you mentioned in the intro, getting canceled. Those types of trends.
Hmm. Well, yeah. Does the datum in any way indicate again whether or not we're even able to have the conversation anymore?
Yeah,
Like
we've
how
asked that
entrenched
question
are the
actually.
two sides?
Yeah, we've asked that question, and people do feel like it's more difficult. We noticed a big trend actually post COVID, and I think that there was a thing where, we went into our bubbles a little bit for 18 months, 2 years, and we came out, and what happened is we had the Freedom Convoy, we had, I think, more politicization of some of these issues than even we've ever seen before, with Justin Trudeau making some inflammatory comments about people who were opposing vaccinations, which ended up being, if you look at it in the data, say it's 8 to 12%, that's still hundreds of thousands of people who are now feel like the prime minister is attacking them and talking about them personally. And then you've got Pierre Poilievre, who's coming out and taking some very strong positions on the other side. So you've got these two main leaders going back and forth, and the dialogue isn't particularly friendly or productive a lot of the time. And when we came out of COVID, we found a majority of people saying, it's just harder to talk to people that you don't know these days. So that's certainly something that we're seeing, is that people say we're changing the way we talk, and they're just having a harder time communicating with each other. So we've got to figure out how to find some common ground, and that's one thing that we really want to do with this project. And I think when we get to the end of it, we want to wrap this and say, where do we actually agree? Where can we find common ground and really move forward on this, and not just be arguing, which we tend to be doing a lot of in the public discourse.
Well, what do you attribute this shift then from conversation and debate to just basically arguing?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is, and I described it in the report, is there are a lot of it, I think, is there's social media, which does not help. I think a lot of studies kind of prove this, that minimizing the cues that you use to talk to somebody, just putting it in text. We've all had that experience where you send somebody a text or an email and they completely misunderstand what you're saying. I think it's very easy to get that confused. So I think social media plays a large role in kind of making this a little bit more divisive and amplifying some of these attitudes. And I think a lot of it too is political opportunism. If you look at what has happened with individuals who are quote unquote canceled, they tend to find an audience that is like-minded and begin to speak very passionately to that group. So now you've got one group of people who feel very strongly that they have been misrepresented or mistreated, and they're on a team now. And then you've got people on the other side of the spectrum who you might identify as the more left-leaning. We call them zealous activists in here, so like passionate activists for change, who have a like-minded community as well, who see the value of this. They're sharing research that says, we've got to start using this word, or we've got to stop saying this, or we've got to hold this brand accountable. And you end up with, you've got two sides here who feel very passionately. We measure them as about 37 to 40% of the population. They feel very passionately, and political leaders can, for lack of a better term, capitalize financially on that a lot of the time. And it can be very good for, let's just look at what Max Bernier did over the course of a couple of years. At least personally, if the PPC has not been that effective in being represented in Parliament, he certainly raised his profile and fundraised very well off of that. So you can see how it gets leveraged by public personalities, and we just get deeper and deeper into these conversations and dig in deeper on each side of it. And for a lot of people in the middle, they're just watching, saying, "What the heck is happening here?"
Well, on that note, Dave, of the Canadians you polled, how do people view the culture wars? I mean, obviously you have the two extremes, but what about that big chunk in the middle?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and what I found is really interesting is that There are groups who see this really as a they have a different purpose in engaging. So if you look at the people who are maybe on the more left leaning side, the zealous activists, and even what we call quiet accommodators, who are kind of center left leaning. They identify progressively on a lot of issues, but they're just not. They don't feel as strongly about it. They're not vociferous in their support of it, but they tend to agree. Um, those groups see this as, if you ask them to define it, they see it as important. They see it as informative. So they're changing hearts and minds almost in their minds, saying, we're making progress here. It might be tough. We might have to, argue with each other for a while, but we're going to get there. Whereas if you look at the center right and maybe the further on the conservative traditionalist side of the spectrum, they're seeing this as divisive. They're seeing it as unnecessary. That's a big word. 3/4 of our defiant objector group, which is 20% of the population, 3/4 of them say that these are just unnecessary. They don't really see the value of starting all of these conversations and trying to hold people accountable. They just want to go about their business and do their thing. And a large group, 60% of Canadians overall, say that it's just exhausting. They just, they've been arguing with people about whether it's vaccination or whether it's gender and what's happening in schools. There's a lot of issues that people are having a hard time finding common ground on, and you see that they just see this as really an exhausting trend, and they're not sure when it's going to end and where we're going to, move forward here a little bit.
So it's safe to say that very few people see the conversations as unifying or energizing in any way.
No, those ones didn't score very highly, fewer than 10% on both of those items, which I thought was interesting. We really wanted to get something in there when you're asking Canadians these questions. We asked more than 3,000 people. So we wanted to see, who's actually unified, who's finding these conversations, finding value and purpose in these. And a lot of people, while they might say that they're important or informative, they don't really feel that they're unifying, because almost by definition, you're going to end up in a debate or in a conflict with somebody in the discourse, the way that it's going on right now. I think people are pretty aware of that. And for one group, they're just trying to get through it and to make sure that they represent their ideas and help people. For another group, they're not necessarily thinking that this is the best way to always be looking for somebody to argue with. And then those three groups in the middle, 60% of the population, just tired, but some of them see the value, but none of them really see the unifying element of it.
Now, you touched on this, and we're gonna develop this topic a little more. But do the people you polled think that people being more careful about their words before speaking? Do the people you polled think that's a good thing, a bad thing, or obviously it was probably a mix?
Yeah, they're pretty divided, and it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to, actually, there's quite a gender divide on this. All of the female groups, we've broken it into 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus. So we got some generational breakdown there. All of the female groups are much more likely than their male counterparts to say that it's a good thing to change your language and to be more thoughtful about it. While young men tend to lean that way, they're quite divided. And then really the group there's two groups that are most out of alignment here. And it's men 35 to 54 and young women. So under 35, even more so under 25. But those two groups tend to disagree. So you've got, an inverse number saying with those men in that age bracket saying that we've got to stop this. This is a bad trend, and then younger women saying, no, this is something that we've really got to focus on. This is a good way to go about it. And I thought it was really interesting too. We've got a group who prefer to self-describe. They're not. They don't identify as male or female, and they tend to think that yes, we've by about a 3-to-1 margin that this is a good trend. So you can see where somebody who might have had more difficulty in these conversations over the last decade can say, yeah, being a little bit more inclusive with our language and watching your tongue, being careful is actually a good thing. And they're feeling that they're getting some benefit from that.
Okay, let's take a minute here to talk about what's popularly called cancel culture. What do we know about people who felt that it is overall about suppression?
Yeah, not to lean on on those age groups too much, but really, it's quite a divide in the country, and we've seen this for 6 or 7 years. We started asking this question in the early days of the Trump era, and you do get Canadians who are pretty divided on this. Overall, in the country, 52% say that this is it's a trend that is suppressing free speech. 48% say that no, it's actually holding people accountable. They think that it's a good thing. Um, but when you look at most of the age groups, pretty even 50-50, 53-47. But then you look at those male 35 to 54s, two-thirds of them say that it's suppression and it's political correctness. And then more than 60% of those young women say that it's an important way to ensure that we're holding public figures accountable for their behavior. And if you look at isolating, I was talking about the 40% of Canadians who are kind of divided on either side of this issue. If you take the group that we would consider progressive left, 95% of them say that it's about accountability. If you take the group who are the defiant objectors, the anti-woke, so to speak, 95% of them take the opposite view and say, no, this is suppressing free speech. So it really is a divide, and that's not one I think we're going to solve very quickly, because people just philosophically just disagree about what the purpose is of it. You've got some people out there saying, we've got to call people out when they say something that is offensive. And other people saying, that's just going to make things worse. You've got to let that person have their free speech, even if it is offensive, because that's just the way that they view free speech. So I think that's a
Mhm.
really interesting one, is that we're very divided on that.
Now, Dave, we've talked a little bit about gender and age. What about education levels? Were you able to dig into that at all?
Yeah, we were. And I thought that this might be a little bit more dramatic than it actually is. We've got those university educated Canadians who are quite a bit more likely to say that it is about accountability, but they're only at 55%. So you got a 55-45 split for university educated. If you look at people who are high school or less is how we define it. So you've got your high school diploma, or maybe you didn't quite get there. It's inverted. So it's 54% who say that this is about censorship, and 46% who say that it's about accountability. So even among those groups, there's not a huge gap. Where you do see the big split, I would say, is on that political perspectives. You've got 74% of past conservatives who say that this is censorship, versus on the other side of the spectrum, 60% of liberals and 69% of New Democrats, who tend to feel that this is just accountability. And I'll share just quickly the Saskatchewan number for those listening, is kind of close to home. 59% saying that this is suppression, versus 41% saying that it's accountability. So you can see a little bit of a lean there away from the 50-50 split. Saskatchewan residents a little bit more unified in saying that it is suppression. And that's actually the highest number in the country by a couple of points.
Hmm. Now, you polled people on issues of gender, race, climate, capitalism, the legacies of colonialism, which, on the face of it, are very different topics, but you looked at how they are related. What did you find?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we did is essentially, I took all of the responses. It's 21 different questions. And we're going to actually have a version of this online overnight, where you can actually do the survey, and it will sort you into one of our 5 categories. So that should be interesting for a lot of people to take part in that. That'll be on angusreid.org tomorrow. So what we did is we measured a number of variables across all of those different issues, and made little indexes or indices, to say, okay, so here's people's views on climate change. Here are people's views on capitalism and taxation, and things that might define your economic perspective. Here's what they think about the legacy of colonization and the situation of Indigenous people living in Canada. And made all of these mini indexes to see where the views fall, and then added them all together. to create this kind of spectrum of views. So you've got people who score very progressive on all of those issues, and they end up occupying one space along the spectrum. You got people who score quite what you would call conservative, traditional. The terminology people are using these days is woke and anti-woke. We try to avoid that just because it's such loaded language, and it's one of those things that if you ask Canadians, they don't even know if they know what woke really means anymore. So we didn't want to use that terminology. We're just using progressive and more traditionalist conservative. So you end up with 5 groups. There's those zealous activists that I mentioned, those left-leaning group, which is about 17% of the population. You've got the quiet accommodators who tend to agree with them, but they're a little bit less vocal about it. That's actually the largest group in the Canadian population at 26%. You've got the conflicted middle who tend to pick and choose. They've got views from all along the spectrum. So they end up not really agreeing with one side or the other. They're just in the middle. They're quite exhausted by the conversations, as you might predict. And then you've got frustrated skeptics and defiant objectors, who are both about 1 in 5. So you've got 5 different perspectives, and you can see how they align. You've got younger women in the zealous activist group. You tend to have more men on the other side of the spectrum, more conservatives, certainly more PPC supporters, who are kind of anti-woke. They see this as an attack on people's rights. And then you've got that group in the middle who are a really interesting mix of everybody all across the spectrum, and they really do occupy a middle ground. So that's the lens that we're trying to use to make it a little bit easier to understand across all of these different issues. What are the perspectives, and are there areas where we've got 5 groups, but they actually agree on something? And I think we actually have found a couple of those things in the study that we'll be talking about.
Well, okay, let's end the conversation there, Dave. Did you find any common ground among those 5 groups through this polling?
Yeah, there's some really interesting issues that topically do involve gender, children, trans issues. I think there's a really interesting perspective in Canada where there is a really large, widespread recognition that transgender people in Canada face a really significant amount of discrimination. That's a strong majority view. But there's also this, I think, rallying that you're seeing. And it's popular in Saskatchewan, which is we've got to involve parents in this. We've got to talk to the children about it. There's a real, really interesting kind of emerging conversation there. Most people are supportive of the policy in Saskatchewan that has been really divisive in some areas. There is majority support for that. And I think that there's also a majority recognition that we've got work to do on addressing racism in Canada. That's one of those things where there's a sense that there are groups that have a lot of privilege based on their ethnicity and their position in society, and that we've got to work to kind of help those groups out. So those are some areas where we tend to agree. And climate change. I don't want to forget about that, actually. Despite how much we argue about climate change in Canada, that's one where there's actually not a very large group of people who push back on that issue. They agree that it's happening. They might differ slightly on whether it's human caused or natural, but they still want to see action on it. So I thought that was really interesting as well. There are these areas where I think that we can have common ground, and they have political ramifications that we'll save for another day. But yeah, really interesting study with a lot of areas of commonality and also divisiveness.
Right. Dave, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for explaining this to us today.
No problem. Chat with you later.
Dave Krasinski is research director at the Angus Reid Institute. And again, folks, the topic today, for lack of a better term, really, is the culture wars. And Dave did a pretty good job of outlining where people stand on a number of controversial issues in society today. And also from the polling and from our lived experience, we know that people are having an increasingly difficult time even having a conversation with someone with whose politics they disagree. I'm going to read a quick email before we move on to our political panel. This comes from Chris in Laird. And Chris writes, I've lived in rural Saskatchewan for the last 15 years. And while I've always differed in my political views from many of my neighbors, the last couple of years have been spectacularly difficult. It's hard to have a conversation with someone who subscribes to many of the conspiracy theories out there, be it about vaccines, World Economic Forum, digital IDs, sexual grooming in schools, to name a few. It's beyond concerning at how many people dismiss science and reality because they think they found the truth on Facebook or some sketchy website. Political parties exploit and fuel the divisive divisions that result in their own gain. I think the education system needs to step up and do a better job of teaching children how to critically evaluate the overwhelming amount of information they are exposed to in daily life. That way, we might hope to have a more sophisticated and informed electorate who are better equipped to be informed regarding the truth when it comes to important issues. That came to us from Chris. And again, folks, we'd like to hear from you today via email. Our email address is bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, it was 2 years ago, almost to the day, that our next guests were last on the program. We put together a panel of folks associated with different political parties, but what they have in common is a desire to have thoughtful and respectful conversations. Well, now that 2 years has passed, we thought we'd invite them back to see how they've seen the political and cultural climate shift. Joining us on the phone is Dwayne Filson. He's president of the Liberal Riding Association in Cypress Hills Grasslands. He lives near Gravelburg. That's where we've reached him today. Hello, Dwayne.
Hello.
And joining me in our Saskatoon studio is Jack Saddleback. Jack ran for the NDP nomination in 2021. He describes himself as an equity champion and sociology scholar. Among other things, he's a student at the University of Saskatchewan, taking some time over his lunch hour to join us. So welcome back, Jack. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And since our last panel, that is, Megs Reynolds from the organization Do More Ag, has moved out of the province. So instead of Megs, we're being joined by another woman working in agriculture. Caitlin Kitson is campaigning for the Saskatchewan Party and a member of the Conservative Party of Canada. She's also the Saskatchewan chair for Equal Voice. She's near Yorkton. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, all of you were listening to our conversation with the Angus Reid Society. I'm curious about what stood out for you, and we'll start with you, Dwayne. What from that conversation really stands out for you?
I think the main thing that stood out for me was that there are actually areas of broad agreement, and I didn't really expect to hear that, but I think that that's probably a plus.
Where did you see the areas of broad agreement? What did you take from that?
For example, in of the climate change, I think that that's a pretty responsible position for a lot of people to take, and it's good to hear that that is right across all of the spectrums.
Okay. Caitlin, what did you take from the conversation with Dave?
Yeah, definitely, that there is some broad agreement on certain topics, but also just how, over the last few years, some of these conversations were quite easily had, and now they've become, very, exhausting, and almost you try to avoid some of these conversations just because, it's going to turn into, this large debate instead of a productive conversation.
And Jack, what did you take from Dave's conversation?
I thought it was fascinating to look at some of the challenges that we as citizens are having to deal with. What I do enjoy is as well hearing that there are some comparative or like mutual agreements that are happening, specifically around climate change. The more divisiveness or the wording around divisiveness, I think, is something to also highlight within this larger conversation.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about how you're seeing people communicate and the sort of the state of political debate in the province lately. What's been your experience on social media over the last couple of years? And do you think you've seen a shift in how people communicate with one another? Caitlin?
Yeah, for sure. So, throughout my university and early years, I hung out a lot with, multi-partisan groups, Equal Voice, even started a not-for-profit, with somebody from the NDP party. But over the last few years, I've just noticed, you try to have conversations on a topic that, we have common grounds on, but it comes back to other topics, or it turns into not being productive and almost, hitting that disrespectful phases. I know on my personal social media, I'm very cautious now what I can post because I feel like anything somebody can take and make it controversial. And so it's just being a lot more careful of what I put out there personally, and also who I talk to and what I say.
Jack, what do you think about the state of political discourse? Are you able to even have a conversation anymore with somebody with whom you fundamentally disagree?
I think it's fascinating to look at the shift in communication styles. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that we, as a large world, has gone through a very traumatic time. And with movement now having to go online, folks, I think, have really gotten to a lot of silos of confirmation bias and thinking as if many other individuals have the same sort of views as them due to the silos that take place on social media. I find having conversations in person are the best way to be able to find mutual standings, to be able to recognize that it isn't necessarily me versus you at all. No, it's us versus an issue. It's us discussing a topic. It's us looking at possible solutions to the global challenges.
Yeah. Dwayne, what do you think about the state of discourse?
I agree with what Jack said. On a personal level, there isn't that animosity that comes across on the social media that is sometimes just so antagonistic and angry. It's disturbing because those kinds of statements would never be made person to person, face to face, and that's something that people who do put a lot of things out there onto the internet should really consider. Okay, if I were standing side by side with this person, would I say this? And maybe they should just tone it down a little bit to be a little bit more respectful.
Well, Dwayne, I just want to follow up with you a little bit more because you are a liberal in grasslands, and I mean you are a one red twig in a sea of blue. What sort of conversations are you able to have with neighbors?
There's more of us than you think, but not very many want to talk about it. But on a personal level, I have absolutely no problem. Everybody understands where I'm coming from, and I feel like as if I've been a person of integrity, and they respect that. So I just don't have any problem on a personal level. And I don't really interact much with the kind of nonsense that comes across these feeds, and I'm pretty aware of them. My wife is very interested in those things, and she debunks everything she can possibly find, and I just let her go to it.
Hmm. Now, Caitlin, I want to get back. I'll ask all three, but I want to get back to you because you brought it up first. Tell me about the difference you notice between how people communicate online and how people communicate, say, over a cup of coffee.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you mentioned, I am right now campaigning for a nomination for the Saskatchewan Party. And, the comments or the people who will interact with me online, and then, you see them at a community event a few days later or a week later, and it's a completely different tone or a way that they approach things. So I think it's, a lot easier to hide behind a keyboard or hide behind a screen instead of facing the person. But I also truly believe that people just want to be heard. And that's what I'm noticing on the campaign trail is they just want somebody to listen to them, listen to their perspective. And, Jack said it really well. Like we went through a traumatic experience and there's still a lot of hurt. There's still lots of, people grieving. There's people, angry, and they just want to be heard. So yeah, I definitely think, online has increased some of our, disrespectfulness compared to in person. But my experience in person, like Jack said, it's a lot easier to have a conversation than trying to, have that conversation online.
And Jack, I want you to develop that theme a little more. Maybe you could share an example or two where you've been able to have a conversation in person that you couldn't possibly have had online.
Certainly. Well, for myself, being a out and proud Cree, two-spirit, transgender gay man, I find what has happened over this past few years with the influence of American politics, especially around anti-trans individuals, has certainly popped up more on my own personal social media platforms. That being people looking to attack just my being as a whole. Now, the fascinating aspect that I find when having conversations in person is that people are then able to actually see the humanity of an individual. We're able to see that I deserve to have a full, happy, thriving life, just like they do as well. Now, with online, I completely agree with Caitlin here that it's much easier to hide behind a keyboard for people to throw mud, pretty much. When in person, it's much easier to practice empathy and kindness.
Well, okay, I'll just put this question to each of you. I'll start with you, Dwayne. Has social media, in your view, poisoned our political discourse?
I don't know if it has really made it any worse if you go back and look at the kind of debates that have been held historically. I think it probably I think Jack talked earlier about silos. And I agree that has happened, and that tends to give support to opinions that aren't necessarily made out of common sense, and it is sometimes difficult. You can't really argue with those kind of points if they're so far out there. And they don't really even notice that they're so far out there because they don't have a broader conversation.
Yeah. Caitlin, I'll put that question to you. Do you think social media has poisoned our political discourse?
Well, I'm going to give you your typical politician answer here. Yes and no, maybe in the middle there, because, social media has allowed politics to reach other people that it traditionally maybe wouldn't have reached, especially on my own campaign, those different generations who maybe aren't at the political events. So it has done a lot of good, I think, politically to really get people engaged and to understand what the issues are. However, if people, I think, online forget that, you have to treat people the way that you want to be treated, the golden rule that I know many of us were taught when we were little. So yes, I think it, caused some more silos. It caused the whole kind of polarization of politics. Like it has caused us down this, kind of interesting path. But so yeah, yes and no. I think I can't imagine politics without social media, but it also has its cons to it.
How about you, Jack?
I think it has opened up many conversations for folks, as Caitlin was alluding to, that there are areas of life that they don't necessarily have experience with. They are able to interact with one another. But that being said, when it comes to social media, I think it's positive for individuals to have conversations about politics, to have conversations about some of these quote-unquote hot topic issues. That being said, though, we also need people to start having conversations in person again. Prior to the pandemic, I think it was much easier to have these conversations because people weren't living online as we have over this past few years. And I know that we are coming out of this now traumatic time. We're starting to learn how to live with COVID, but we also have to relearn empathy with one another. We have to relearn how to interact in person once again and start hopping off of Zoom and start hopping into the local coffee shop to go and chat with your neighbors.
I want to talk a little bit about the effect politicians and their political discourse has on all these questions. And, a lifetime ago, I worked as a researcher on Parliament Hill. And I would watch people on each side of the aisle go at it tooth and nail. And then later that evening, see them having dinner together in the parliamentary cafeteria or parliamentary restaurant, often discussing those issues that they did agree on, and or maybe they were two MPs from opposite sides of the aisle, but they were from the same province, for instance, and so they would sit and discuss those. I'm just curious, Caitlin, I'm going to start with you because you are most intimately involved in the process right now. Can you see that happening now?
Yes, I do think it still happens. I was just out in Ottawa earlier this year and, saw some MPs sitting in question period where, going back and forth. And then saw them at a local pub later having great conversations or, playing hockey. So yes, I think that can still happen, but I've always questioned, like, is there fear of like, oh, this MP's hanging out with this MP from different parties, and if a picture gets onto social media, what can that mean? So I don't know if
Mhm.
that has happened yet, but everything seems to be in question. But I do think that can still happen. And I have talked to a lot of, NDP MLAs about my nomination run. And, if I have the opportunity to serve Yorkton here, how I want to work with them on, different files, especially, agriculture, being a farm kid and a farmer here.
Mhm.
So, yes, but I think people are a little bit more careful just due to the public perception of it.
I want to reform the question just a little bit for Dwayne and Jack, and I'll start with you, Dwayne. Is some of what we're seeing a reflection of what we're seeing on the national and to some extent the provincial political stage? Has the rhetoric of our political leaders in some way affected our ability to have these conversations? What do you think, Dwayne?
Um, Boy, I don't know. I think it has to a certain extent, and I guess it always depends from which side you're coming from. And for me, it is. I look at especially Scott Moe's comments in regard to anything Trudeau related, and they are just as they couldn't be more divisive than they are. But on the other hand, you see behind the scenes his government working very closely with the national government on a number of different issues, and so the rhetoric is goes beyond what is real, and
Yeah.
I find it unnecessary. But that's it works politically for the SAS party to do that, but it really is. It annoys me that they think they have to, because they really don't have to.
Yeah. And Jack, in our conversation with Dave from Angus Reid, Maxime Bernier came up a few times, actually. There's maybe an extreme example, but what are your thoughts? Has the political discourse among politicians poisoned the way we have those conversations here on the ground?
I think it is vital for political leaders and community leaders as a larger group to emulate healthy conflict, to emulate healthy conversations. As we were just sharing there, Maxime unfortunately is not emulating healthy conflict. In fact, some of the divisiveness and negative rhetoric that he's spewing unfortunately incites violence towards us LGBTQ individuals, incites violence towards trans folks like myself, and these types of conversations, the way and behavior, I think, is truly a sad part of Canadian politics right now that are being influenced from American politics, that are then also influencing politics over in the United Kingdom. These same words and verbiage that the political leaders are using directly affect individuals like myself, and I think that they should be thinking twice about how to emulate healthy conflict.
Okay. Caitlin, something I wanted to ask you about. You're a member of a group called Equal Voice, which is a multi-partisan group dedicated to supporting women and gender-diverse candidates in government. How's that been going lately?
Yeah, so I was involved from an early age, not as chair on the executive committee, but I had attended a lot of their events. I was one of their Daughters of the Vote delegates. It was really great. They brought 338, women to Ottawa to sit in the seats, and this was pre-pandemic and great conversations, great conference. Since COVID, we've had a few events here in Saskatchewan, and it was very eye-opening to me because these are almost the same events we would have had pre-pandemic. And it was, I wouldn't say like it got out of hand or anything, but it was more difficult for me to moderate great conversations. Um, with my panel members almost trying to attack each other, and then the pointed questions from the floor, and I'm like, whoa, we're all here for the same reason, and we're not here to attack one or other's viewpoints or policies. So it's just, I think, we're seeing it everywhere, and unfortunately it's hurting those organizations. My other not-for-profit that I work with, that's multi-partisan, our executive is multi-partisan. I've seen us having more heated conversations, or closing down conversation, because it's like, well, we can't even talk about this, which you know everybody's going to have different opinions. I don't expect to solve that. We just have to have those conversations in a respectful and productive way, which is becoming more and more challenging.
Okay, and one last question as we quickly run out of time, as we always do, and we're having a good conversation. I'm going to start with you, Jack. Do you think to be a member of a political party today, you have to buy every policy of that party, or is there still room to be maybe a little bit out of step with the party?
I think it's important for every citizen.
Sorry.
I think it's important for every citizen to think critically. Even within their own political parties, there are going to be issues or topics that you may not necessarily agree with the larger party, and it's important to hold your own individual viewpoints at the same time, and then also hold your political parties accountable to some of the topics that they may be misinformed on or misguided on.
Dwayne, how do you feel? Do you feel that you have to support all of your party's positions, or is there still room for a little bit of internal debate?
I think that would be utterly impossible, Garth. But honestly, I always feel like, that you have to be true to yourself, and you're never going to have complete agreement. But as a general rule, you would agree with the direction that your party would be taking, and that's really all you can ask for, and as much as you can, try to influence that direction. And it's something that goes back to my history teacher in high school saying, get involved, and that is the big reason why I became a liberal is so that I could be part of the political process, and I think everybody should take advantage of that.
And Caitlin?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to agree with everything your political party. I just think that you need to, align yourself with the party that it most aligns with your values. And I think we saw that at the National Conservative Convention here just a few weeks ago, that we need healthy debate to make the party stronger. And I don't want that to end anytime soon.
All right. Jack, Dwayne, Caitlin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
It's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you.